There is a road in Belgium that runs south from Bastogne through farmland that looks, in the summer, like a postcard. Cattle in the pastures, church spires above the trees. If you had driven that road in the winter of 1944, you would have driven past the burned-out hulks of the last great armoured attack the German army ever launched in the West. And if you had asked the American tank crews who put those hulks in the snow how they did it, they would have told you a story that had almost nothing to do with tanks. It was 6:25 in the morning, December 30th, 1944, and outside a Belgian farming hamlet called Lutrebois, the crews of the 1st SS Panzer Division were wiping frost off their gun sights and waiting for a signal to move. The temperature had dropped below 0 Fahrenheit overnight, the roads had frozen into sheets of black ice, snow lay knee-deep in the fields on either side of the tank column, undisturbed except for the tracks of hares. Inside the turret of a Panther tank near the front of the column, a young Waffen-SS sergeant named Manfred Thorn pulled his gloves tighter over his frozen fingers and looked out through the frost on his periscope at nothing. He was 22 years old. He had been fighting for the Third Reich since he was 18. He wore, stitched to the cuff of his tunic, the name of the man who had sent him here. Adolf Hitler. The tank in front of Thorn belonged to Sturmbannführer Werner Pötschke, the officer who would command the Northern Spearhead that morning. In a few hours, that tank would be burning in a snowfield, with its commander pulled out and stuffed into a Panzer IV moving somewhere else. In a few days, most of the crews Thorn could see through his periscope would be dead, or captured, or riding home in ambulances with their faces wrapped in gauze. But that morning, at 6:25, none of them knew that yet, they only knew what they had been told. Drive west a few kilometers, take a wooded ridge, cut a single road. Simple. The road they wanted to cut ran through two villages that most of the men in those tanks could not have found on a map a week earlier. Lutrebois, Villers-le-Bonneau, a pair of names that meant nothing in the history of the Reich until that morning, and that would mean everything by nightfall. The road they wanted to cut was the only supply line into a town called Bastogne, and the men waiting for them on the other side of that ridge had been in the line for 3 days. To understand how the most fanatical armoured division in the German army ended up dying in a Luxembourg snowfield chasing a single stretch of asphalt, you have to go back 2 weeks. You have to go back to the moment nobody, on the Allied side, thought the German army could still do what it did. 2 weeks earlier, on the morning of December 16, 1944, more than 200,000 German soldiers walked out of the frozen pine forests of the Ardennes behind a wall of artillery fire. With them rolled nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns. Among them were the new Tiger II heavy tanks, 70-ton monsters whose frontal armour no Allied gun could reliably penetrate. The German code name for the offensive was Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Hitler's goal was breathtaking. He wanted to split the American and British armies down the middle, drive northwest across 150 kilometers of forest and river, and seize the great Belgian supply port of Antwerp before the Allies could react. If it worked, the Western Allies would be forced to negotiate. Germany could turn everything east against the Red Army. For the first week, it worked better than anyone thought possible. American units were caught sleeping. The line buckled. The German advance carved a wedge 50 miles wide and 70 miles deep into the Ardennes, and the shape of that wedge on a map gave the whole battle the name it carries today. The Bulge. Everything in the German plan ran on roads, and in the Ardennes, in the winter, every road ran through one place. Bastogne, a little market town where 7 main highways converged in a spoke around a stone church and a hospital and a train station. 7 roads. That was all Bastogne was, and that was everything. An armoured army trying to reach Antwerp had to move on wheels and tracks needed roads, and the roads went through Bastogne. The Germans surrounded the town on the 20th of December. Inside the perimeter were the paratroopers of the American 101st Airborne Division, along with a scratch collection of tank crews and gunners who had fallen back into the pocket as the front collapsed around them. The garrison was short on ammunition, it was short on food, it was almost out of morphine. Surgeons operated in the basement of a seminary by the light of gasoline lanterns. Men wrapped their frozen feet in burlap sacks and blanket scraps and held their positions because there was nowhere left to fall back to. Frostbite took soldiers as steadily as German shells. On the 22nd of December, a German officer came forward under a white flag and demanded that the town surrender. The acting American commander was a brigadier general named Anthony McAuliffe. He was 46 years old, an artillery officer by training, quiet and reserved, and not the sort of man who was expected to become famous. He wrote his answer on a piece of paper, 4 letters. Nuts. The German officer had to have it explained to him. While McAuliffe held on inside Bastogne, 140 miles to the south, a very different American general was already moving. His name was George Smith Patton, Jr. He was 59 years old. He commanded the American Third Army, and unlike almost every other senior Allied commander in Europe, he had seen the German attack coming. He had not seen it alone. To tell this story honestly, you have to introduce a man whose name almost nobody remembers. A colonel named Oscar Koch. He was Patton's chief intelligence officer, the head of Third Army's G2. He was Wisconsin-born, methodical, undramatic, the kind of officer who read every scrap of paper that came across his desk and cross-referenced it 3 times before he said anything out loud. For weeks before the offensive, Koch had been quietly counting things. Of the 15 German Panzer divisions known to be in the West, only about 5 were still identifiable along the front line by the middle of November. The rest had vanished, not destroyed, just vanished, pulled out of the line and hidden somewhere behind the Rhine to refit. Koch flagged it. He told his general that somewhere in the German rear was a powerful armoured reserve, perhaps 500 tanks, being hoarded for a blow that was still to come. Most senior Allied commanders looked at the same reports and shrugged. They had convinced themselves that the German army was finished. They had been telling themselves that for months. It was easier to believe than the alternative. Patton did not shrug. He told his staff to start drawing up plans for the most difficult maneuver in the entire military playbook, a 90-degree turn. Pull Third Army out of its attack toward the Saar, swing it north into Luxembourg, attack toward Bastogne. He wrote in his diary that he wanted to be in a position to meet whatever happened. That single sentence is the reason the second twist of this story exists. Because when Eisenhower called his senior commanders to Verdun on the 19th of December and asked how quickly anyone could attack north, the moment that made Patton a legend was not what it looked like. Patton stood up in that briefing room and told the Supreme Allied Commander that he could have 3 divisions attacking north inside 48 hours. The room went silent. Nobody else in that building could have said it and meant it. The myth is that this was a flash of pure military genius. A great captain reading the battlefield and pulling the answer out of the air. The truth is quieter and in some ways more impressive. Patton could say 48 hours because Oscar Koch had spent weeks warning him, and because Patton's staff had already secretly drafted the march orders. Phone lines had already been laid, routes had already been reconnoitred, fuel dumps had already been identified, the plan was in a drawer waiting for a signature. The genius was not the instinct, the genius was the preparation, and the preparation began the moment Koch put a pin on a map and said, "We are missing 5 Panzer divisions and nobody seems to care." 3 days after Verdun, on the 22nd of December at 6 in the morning, 3 American divisions attacked north into the snow. The 4th Armoured, the 26th Infantry, the 80th Infantry, the main effort drove straight up the highway from Ardennes toward Bastogne. Patton's order to his lead tank commander was blunt. Drive like hell. They drove. It took 5 days. Every mile was a fight. The Germans had learned early in the war that roads through the Ardennes meant choke points, and they used every one of them. Wrecked vehicles clogged the shoulders. Artillery fell on the column for hours at a stretch. Roadblocks had to be reduced one at a time. The cold alone was enough to kill a soldier who stopped moving. At the tip of the spearhead was the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by a lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams. Abrams was 30 years old. He was a career armor officer from Massachusetts, short and stocky and famously blunt. He smoked cigars and swore at his tanks when they broke down. His men would follow him anywhere. On the afternoon of December 26th, with cargo planes overhead dropping ammunition into the Bastogne perimeter, Abrams looked at his map and made a decision that no manual would have supported. He was going to gamble. The village of Assenois sat directly between his lead tanks and the American lines inside Bastogne. It was held by German infantry and covered by artillery. The book said to reduce it slowly. The book said to soften it up. Abrams did not have time for the book. He called down every piece of artillery he could reach and told his lead company to drive straight through the town while the shells were still landing. He did not stop for enemy fire. He did not stop for wrecked vehicles. He drove. By a little after 5 o'clock that evening, his lead tank rolled through the American perimeter and shook hands with a sergeant of the 101st Airborne. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The cost had been 1,000 American casualties from the 4th Armored Division alone. Some of Abrams's tank companies were down to a handful of running vehicles, but the road was open, and here is where the third twist of the story lives. Because breaking the siege did not end the battle, it reversed it. The single corridor that Abrams had pried open was now the only way in or out of Bastogne. Every wounded man came down that road. Every truckload of ammunition and ration cans came up it, and with Bastogne reinforced, the town no longer sat inside the German advance as a besieged garrison. It sat inside the German advance as a knife. Every German division still trying to push west now had to do it with American artillery on its flank and American armor threatening its supply lines. The little crossroads town that had been an obstacle had become the center of gravity of the entire battle. As long as the Americans held Bastogne, the German drive west was finished. Hitler understood this. Sitting in his bunker in East Prussia, hundreds of miles from the fighting, he made a decision. If he could not go around Bastogne, he would strangle it. He would cut the one road that kept it alive. He would isolate the garrison all over again, and this time he would use, to do the cutting, the most reliable instrument of violence he had left. He would use his own bodyguard. The 1st SS Panzer Division carried a longer name than that. The full title, embroidered on the cuff bands of every man in the division, was Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. The Life Guard. It had begun before the war as a small ceremonial unit assigned to protect Hitler at rallies and party functions. It grew from that into a regiment, then a brigade, then a full armoured division. Its officers were promoted through the ranks of the Waffen-SS. Its men were selected for physical fitness and racial ideology and political reliability. Its combat record was written in the worst fighting of the Eastern Front. Kharkov, Kursk, the retreat through Ukraine. Wherever the German army needed a line held or a breakthrough forced, the Leibstandarte was somewhere in the picture. And wherever it went, the killing was worse. By the end of December 1944, the division was a shadow of the reputation it carried. It had been thrown into the northern shoulder of the Bulge in the first week of the offensive. It had spearheaded the deepest German penetration under a battle group commanded by an Obersturmbannführer named Joachim Pieper, who was already infamous for the massacre of American prisoners near a Belgian crossroads called Malmedy. Pieper's battle group had been cut off. Pieper himself had been ground down to physical and mental collapse and evacuated to the rear. The rest of the Leibstandarte had been chewed up trying to reach him. The division that limped south toward Bastogne in the last days of December was exhausted, low on fuel, and missing much of its combat strength. On paper, it still counted 16 Panther tanks and 26 Panzer IVs in its tank battalion, another 18 Jagdpanzer tank destroyers, and 33 Tiger II heavy tanks in an attached heavy battalion, of which fewer than half were operational. 93 armoured vehicles on the books. In reality, fuel shortages and broken roads meant that probably fewer than 50 ever reached the Bastogne sector. 50 out of 93. The divisional commander was a 33-year-old SS brigade Führer named Wilhelm Mohnke. He was tall, angular, humorless. He had fought in Poland and France and the Balkans. He had lost part of one foot at the beginning of the war. He was by every account a true believer. Mohnke split what he had left into two fists. The northern fist he handed to Sturmbannführer Werner Pötschke. Pötschke got the armour, every running Panther, every running Panzer IV. Two thin battalions of Panzer Grenadiers. His mission was to take a village called Lutrebois and push on to the Bastogne-Arlon highway near a hamlet called Remonfossé. The southern fist he handed to Obersturmbannführer Max Hansen. Hansen got the tank destroyers and the remnants of two more infantry battalions. His mission was to seize Villers-le-Bonneau and reach the same road farther down. Once both fists were on that road, they were to turn and link hands with two more German formations driving in from the west. Colonel Otto Riemer's Führer Escort Brigade, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, together they would seal the corridor between Assenois and Ypres. Bastogne would be cut off again. On a clean situation map in a warm headquarters, it looked like a textbook pincer. The problem was that the map never showed what a formation actually had left after 3 weeks of the Bulge. And the map never showed the ground. The ground on the east side of the corridor was held by the American 35th Infantry Division under Major General Paul Bard. The 35th was a National Guard division from Kansas and Missouri. It had landed in Normandy in July. It had fought its way through the hedgerows and across the Moselle and into Lorraine. By December, it was a veteran unit that had learnt exactly what German Panzer Grenadiers looked like coming out of a tree line. The regiment directly in the path of the SS attack was the 134th Infantry. It had captured most of the village of Lutrebois in the early evening of December 29th, less than 12 hours before Puczki's tanks were scheduled to attack through it. The Germans did not know that. Their intelligence maps were a day out of date. The flank they were about to attack, the flank that looked so thin on their acetate overlays, was not thin at all. It was a rifle regiment that had been in the line long enough to know its ground, backed by tank destroyers hidden in the tree lines, backed by the massed artillery of the entire Third Army wired together by radio. None of that was visible from the assembly area at Lutrebois. From the assembly area at Lutrebois, all Werner Puczka could see was fog and snow and the dim shapes of his own panthers waiting for the order to move. He was 30 years old. He had won the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross earlier that year for actions on the Eastern Front. He had been wounded so many times that the paperwork required to list his decorations ran to 2 pages. He knew the artillery preparation his attack was supposed to receive would not be there, because the guns did not have the shells. He gave the order anyway. At 6:25 in the morning, the engines of the 1st SS Panzer Division coughed to life in the freezing dark, and the last great armoured attack the German army would ever launch in the west began to roll forward through the snow. They were driving toward a ridge above a burning village. On that ridge, 6 American tank crews were already awake, engines cold, guns loaded, waiting for them. They did not know it yet, but they were driving into the most efficient killing machine on the Western Front. The artillery barrage that was supposed to soften the American line began at 6:15. It was thin, too thin. The gunners were rationing shells they no longer had. For weeks, the supply columns of the 5th Panzer Army had been losing a quiet war of their own. Ammunition trucks lost priority to fuel trucks. Fuel trucks lost priority to tank transporters. What reached the front was a fraction of what the plan called for. On the map at headquarters, the pre-attack barrage looked like a solid wall of fire that would break the American forward positions and let the Panzer Grenadiers walk through the wreckage. On the ground at Lutrebois, it sounded like a spring rain. American soldiers of the 134th Infantry lay in their foxholes and listened to it, and did not even wake all of their buddies. At 6:25, Werner Puczka gave the order and the panthers rolled. They came out of Lutrebois on 2 parallel roads through the dark and the fog, engines howling in low gear, tracks slipping on ice. There was no air cover. There would never be air cover. The Luftwaffe was a memory now, rationed out in tiny packets that never arrived when they were promised. But the fog that morning sat thick and low over the fields, and for the first hour of the attack, the fog did the Luftwaffe's job for it. The German tanks were invisible from the sky. They were, for a little while, invisible from the ridge, too. Werner Puczka was 30 years old, and he was doing what he had been trained to do since he was a boy. Push forward, keep pushing forward, trust the speed, trust the shock. The men in the tanks behind him were the elite of the Waffen-SS, veterans of Kharkov and Kursk and Normandy. They knew how to flank a defense in weather that grounded everything else. They did not know that the flank they were attacking was not a flank. They did not know that Paul Bardy's 35th Infantry had captured Lutrebois 12 hours earlier and was already dug in. They did not know that 6 Sherman tanks and a platoon of tank destroyers from the 700 and 1st Tank Destroyer Battalion were parked, engines off, on the reverse slope of a ridge 2,000 meters to the west. They did not know that a spotter plane was already in the air. While the Panthers pushed through Lutrebois on the southern road, Obersturmbannführer Max Hansen's Kampfgruppe was doing something different. Hansen had the Jagdpanzer tank destroyers and the remnants of his infantry. His target was a smaller village called Villers-le-Bon-Eau, about 4 kilometers south of Lutrebois. Villers was held by 2 rifle companies of the 1st Battalion, 137th Infantry, about 170 men dug into stone farmhouses and root cellars, and a small chapel wired to their regiment by a single radio. For the first 2 hours of the attack, the fight for Villers was the war in miniature. The Jagdpanzers pulled up to point-blank range and put 75mm shells through the front doors of the farmhouses one by one. Stone walls that could stop a rifle bullet did nothing against a tank gun. Buildings collapsed onto the men firing from inside them. Roofs caught fire, and the fire spread from house to house through the timber beams. An American radio operator called back to regiment and asked for artillery on the German positions. There was a pause. Then the radio went dead. The 2 rifle companies at Villers were surrounded. They were overrun. Of roughly 170 men who started the morning in that village, most were killed or captured. Only 1 company's worth got out alive. By any measure, that was a German victory. And here is where the 4th twist of this story sits, because when Max Hansen's tank destroyers finished burning Villers and drove out the other side of the village to complete their mission, they came to the edge of the forest. And they stopped. In front of them was 2 kilometers of open snow. Beyond that open snow was the Bastogne highway. The road they had come to cut, the whole reason for the attack. And on the low hills on the other side of the road, American Sherman tanks were already turning their turrets toward them. The Jagdpanzer was a lethal weapon in a village street. In a tight room, at close range, its low silhouette and heavy front armor made it a killer. Out in the open, on flat snow, without cover, without concealment, it was a slow-moving target painted grey against a white background. Hansen looked at the field. He looked at his fuel gauges. He looked at the American tanks in the distance. He ordered his men to dig in where they stood. He had won his battle for the village. He had lost his battle for the road. They were not the same battle. Back on the northern road, Werner Pötschke's Panthers were still moving. The Panzer Grenadiers with them had slipped through the woods on either side of the main approach and infiltrated past the American forward positions in the fog. They were pushing into the eastern edge of Lutrebois when the first American tanks opened fire. 7 Panzer IVs from Pötschke's spearhead had swung wide to the north, hunting for the road beyond the village. They were following what looked like an open flank. American tank destroyers hidden in a tree line killed 4 of them in less than a minute. Artillery accounted for 2 more. The last Panzer IV rolled over a mine on a farm track and through a track and burned there for the rest of the day, marking the northern boundary of the German attack like a black flag stuck in the snow. 7 tanks gone before they had even reached open ground. Word of the assault reached the headquarters of Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division at 6:55 in the morning. Combat Command A had been sitting on the ridge just east of the precious road, facing north, waiting for trouble from a completely different direction. Its commander was Brigadier General Herbert L. Ernest. When the message came in that a battalion of German infantry, 20 to 30 tanks, and self-propelled guns were driving Lutrebois, he made a decision inside 60 seconds. He swung his combat command east. He fed an armoured infantry battalion and 2 companies of tanks from the 35th Tank Battalion into the woods west of Lutrebois. He called every artillery battalion in range and told them to stand by for coordinates. Then he waited. At about 11 o'clock in the morning, the fog began to burn off. The German tank crews felt it before they saw it. The light through their vision blocks changed from grey to a pale milky white. Sound carried differently. The horizon reappeared in pieces. By 11:30 they could see for 2 kilometers. By noon they could see for 4. By 12:15 they were fully exposed on flat snow, grey tanks on a white field, and the sky above them was no longer their friend. This is the fifth twist of the story, and it is the one that broke them. The fog that had protected them all morning had also lied to them. It had lied to them about how far they had come. It had lied to them about how deep they had pushed. It had let them advance beyond the point at which they could be quickly extracted, and when it lifted all at once, and it left them standing in the open. There was nowhere to go. The lead Panthers had pushed onto a piece of high ground from which their commanders could finally see what they had come for. 3 or 4 kilometers of the Bastogne road stretched out below them through the last of the mist, a grey strip through the white fields. Nearly empty, carrying, on quiet stretches, the supply trucks that fed the entire garrison inside Bastogne. They were close enough to see the vehicles. They were close enough to believe the attack was working. They were, though they did not know it, close enough to be seen from an unarmed spotter plane circling above the battlefield at low altitude. The pilot was an American artillery observer flying a Piper L4 Grasshopper. 2 seats, no armor, no armament, a civilian airframe with military paint. His job was to see things and radio them to the guns, except his radio was dead. He looked down through the last of the mist and saw 6 German tanks pushing through a tree line south of Lutrebois. He saw them turning to hunt a small group of American Shermans that had appeared on their left. He saw them expose their thin side armor to a low ridge on which nothing seemed to be waiting for them. He looked at the ridge again, and he saw them, 6 Shermans of B Company 35th Tank Battalion, turrets down behind the crest. Only their gun mantlets visible, engines off, waiting. He had no radio, he had a pencil, he had a scrap of paper. He wrote the coordinates, wrapped the paper around a small stone, and dropped it out the side window of the Grasshopper into the American position. This is the 6th twist of the story. The weapon that killed the German attack that morning was not a tank. It was not a gun, it was not even a radio, it was a pencil, a scrap of paper, and the 4 seconds it took for that paper to fall from an aircraft to a foxhole. The Shermans of B Company waited. They did not move, they did not fire early. They watched the German company come on through the trees, watched the lead tanks turn to hunt what they thought was their target, watched the flanks come around and expose their sides. Then they fired. The first shot killed the German company commander's tank. The Panzer IV he was riding in stopped dead. Its turret ring hit clean and did not move again. The rest milled about in the open trying to identify where the fire was coming from. They could not see the Shermans. The Shermans were hull down. Only the muzzle flashes were visible, and by the time a German gunner spotted a flash and traversed to it, another Sherman was firing from a different position along the ridge. One by one, the tanks of the German company were knocked out. 6 more Panzer IVs rolled up behind them, following the same route the lead company had taken, and every one of them was destroyed or disabled. The tank destroyers of the 700 and 1st turned their attention to the assault guns, trailing the armor, and shot up 3 of them. The Panzer Grenadiers moving through the snow behind the vehicles were scattered by machine gun fire and killed where they lay. The American claim from that one stretch of the fight was that B Company, 6 Sherman tanks strong, engaged 13 German tanks and destroyed 11 of them without losing a single American vehicle. And then the sky opened. The P-47 Thunderbolts of the 19th Tactical Air Command came down through the clearing weather in flights of 4, wing to wing, engines howling. They had been waiting for this. For much of the offensive, the weather over Belgium had grounded them. They had sat on frozen airfields in France, watching the sky and cursing the fog. Now the fog was gone. The Thunderbolt was a heavy fighter designed for one specific mission, killing German armor. It carried 500-pound bombs, 5-inch rockets, and 8 50 caliber machine guns in the wings. The rockets and bombs could break the back of a Panther on its thin top deck. The machine guns shredded any soft-skinned vehicle in a column. The pilots of the 19th had been doing this since Normandy. They knew the shape of a Panzer IV in a hedgerow. They knew what a Panther looked like from the air, in bad light. They knew what a German column looked like caught in the open. The main body of Werner Pötschke's Kampfgruppe, roughly 25 tanks and assault guns, had bunched up on the road between Lutrebois and Lutrebois. The road was too narrow for them to spread out. The fields were too soft with new snow for their tracks. They had been moving in a column because a column was the only way they could move. The thunderbolts caught them there. The official history of the United States Army records that the fighter bombers destroyed or crippled 7 of the 25 tanks in the main body and forced the rest to turn back. 7 Panthers, in minutes, from the air. The men in the tanks that survived that pass would remember the sound of the rockets for the rest of their lives. Werner Pötschke's command Panther was hit sometime that afternoon. The account of what happened to him personally is fragmentary, drawn from German post-war interrogations, and the fragmentary accounts of the men who saw it. His tank was disabled. He got out. He climbed onto another vehicle. Somewhere in the confusion of the middle afternoon, the officer who was supposed to be coordinating the entire northern attack was reduced to a passenger in someone else's Panzer IV, unable to see, unable to give orders, unable to do anything except watch his division die around him. The German records from the day are precise on one point. By nightfall, the northern Kampfgruppe had lost at least 20 tanks and assault guns. 20 vehicles, a fifth of the armament had committed, gone in a single day, and not one of them had crossed the Bastogne road. Inside the wrecks of the Panzer IVs on the Lutrebois road, the SS crews who had survived were beginning to talk about what they had seen. A tank commander named Manfred Thorn wrote later that his company had reached the hills outside Lutrebois in the late morning. His company had been driving in a wide wedge across open ground, woods on the right, nothing but snow on the left. He remembered the feeling of exposure. He remembered how the field seemed to stretch in every direction with nowhere to go and nothing to hide behind. He glanced back once, in the early afternoon, and saw several of his own Panthers already hit and burning behind him. Within 10 minutes, 6 of his company's tanks were knocked out. Only 2 of the crewmen from those 6 tanks were killed. The rest got out. Thorn did not write about that as a matter of luck. He did not write about it as a matter of courage. He wrote about it as the mechanical fact of how quickly a man can throw himself out of a burning turret when the choice is between the ice below and the fire above. Another crewman, a sergeant named Rolf Erhardt, remembered the moment his tank was hit. He heard a new sound in the air, harder and drier than artillery, and understood before anyone had told him that the Americans had anti-tank guns sighted on ground the SS could not flank. His tank took a shell somewhere in the turret. When the smoke cleared, he saw that the hatch above his head was simply gone. Only later did he realize that the impact had torn the cannon clean off the mantlet. He was alive because the shell had struck at an angle and sent most of its energy sideways instead of into the crew compartment. Another few degrees, and there would have been nothing left of any of them. This was not a story of skill against skill. This was a story of geometry. Off to the north, another German attack was going wrong in a different way. The 167th Volksgrenadier Division had been given the job of screening the flank of the SS attack and pushing on toward Bastogne from the east. It was commanded by a lieutenant general named Hans-Kurt Hocker. It had detrained from Hungary only days before the attack. It had arrived without its heavy weapons. Here is the 7th twist of the story. Hocker's division was not a division of soldiers. A full third of the men in the ranks of the 167th had spent the war loading bombs onto Luftwaffe aircraft. They were mechanics, armourers, ground crews. They had never been trained as infantry. They had been given rifles, greatcoats, and a place in the line because Germany had run out of trained soldiers to put in the line. They were, by any honest description, factory workers in field grey. Hocker himself said later that his lead battalion was cut to pieces trying to cross the road southeast of Assenois. It ran into the 51st Armoured Infantry Battalion of the 4th Armoured Division, which was dug in with 50 caliber machine guns and half-tracks and the mounted infantry inside them. The 51st fired at close range from prepared positions. The Volksgrenadiers, moving in column because the roads were the only trafficable ground, had no way to deploy. And then something arrived over their heads that the German records never quite understood. The American artillery began to fire proximity-fused shells. The technical name was VT. The soldiers called them POSIT. They were shells with tiny radar sets built into the fuse, set to detonate at a fixed height above the ground rather than on impact. Against exposed infantry in open fields, the effect was surgical. Hocker's men, walking across the snow in company columns, felt the shells burst overhead and could not understand why they were losing men to airbursts when there were no trees for the shells to be striking. Airburst artillery was supposed to require a tree line for the shells to hit. This was open ground, and yet men were falling as though the shells were bursting directly above their heads. That was in fact exactly what was happening. The Bulge was one of the first large-scale ground uses of the proximity fuse. Eisenhower had personally authorized the release of the weapon for ground combat that December because the situation was grave enough to justify surrendering a secret the Navy had been guarding for years. Hocker recorded in his own after-action report that his attack had been broken by fighter bombers and by tree smasher shells, and he never fully worked out what those shells actually were. It did not matter what they were, they killed his men and his attack failed. By nightfall on December 30th, the picture from the German side looked, on paper, like a wedge driven into the American flank. Lutrebois was in German hands. The chateau at Losange was in German hands. Villers-le-Bon-Eau was in German hands. A German staff officer drawing arrows on an acetate overlay could colour a piece of ground 3 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers deep as captured. But the Bastogne-Arlon road, the actual objective, the entire reason the attack had happened, had never been crossed. Supply trucks were still rolling north into Bastogne through the night. Wounded men were still coming south. The corridor that Hitler's bodyguard had been sent to strangle was carrying its traffic in the dark, exactly as it had been carrying it in the morning. At his headquarters, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the 69-year-old commander-in-chief of German forces in the West, read the reports from the front and dictated an entry for his war diary. The forces committed so far, he wrote, appeared to be insufficient to achieve the assigned objective. That single sentence was the German High Command quietly conceding, in the careful language of professional soldiers, that its best division could not cut one road. The next morning, December 31st, the sky was clear from dawn. There would be no fog on New Year's Eve. There would be no cover, there would be no protection from the air. Both German Kampfgruppen attacked again. Both fought their way back up to the Bastogne-Arlon road around midday. Both were thrown back to their start lines by afternoon under a wall of American artillery and counter-attacking Shermans of the 4th Armored Division. The pattern was identical to the day before. That was the problem. The Americans knew where the Germans had to come from. They knew which roads. They had every approach registered by their guns. The Germans knew that the Americans knew, and they attacked anyway because they had no other option and no other ground to work with. Field Marshal Walter Model, the 54-year-old commander of Army Group B, read the same reports Rundstedt was reading. He came to the same conclusion, and then he did something worse. Here is the 8th twist. Model was, by any professional measure, one of the finest field commanders the Wehrmacht had. He was called the Führer's fireman for his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts on the Eastern Front. He was a rational man. He understood mathematics. He understood that the attack on the corridor had failed, and he ordered a 2nd SS Panzer Division into the same fire. The 12th SS Panzer Division was called Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth. It had been built around teenagers conscripted from the youth organizations of the Reich. Boys of 17, 16, some of them 15, put through an accelerated training program and given tanks. They were fanatical. They were brave. They were, in the language of the officers who commanded them, willing to do anything. In the first days of January, the Hitlerjugend was thrown into the same sector where the Leibstandarte had been broken. The result was, by the numbers the Germans themselves recorded, catastrophic. The division lost 7 Panzer IVs, 6 Panthers, 17 Jagdpanzer tank destroyers, 7 of the heavier assault guns, and 18 armoured personnel carriers within a few days. The best general Hitler had on the Western Front had made the same decision Hitler would have made. 2 elite SS Panzer divisions were now feeding themselves into the same American guns. The guns did not care which division was in front of them. The guns fired at whatever moved, and on January 3rd American infantry moved back into Lutrebois for the second time. On January 4th a scratch German counterattack retook part of the village for a few hours. By nightfall it had been lost again. On January 5th and 6th, the Panzer Grenadier battalions of the Leibstandarte, the battalions that were supposed to hold on with the last of the tanks and press one more attack toward the road, were down to 80 men. 100 men. A battalion in the German army at full strength carried several hundred soldiers. What was left was roughly one company wearing the insignia of a battalion. The men in those companies were told to attack the American line one more time. They were 16, 17, 18 years old. Some were 40. Most had frostbite in their feet. Most had not slept for more than an hour at a stretch in a week. Many had lost the men they had trained with in the fields around Lutrebois in the first days of the attack, and the men beside them now were strangers pulled from other companies. They attacked because they were told to attack. They were caught in the open by the massed fire of the artillery battalions of the 35th Infantry Division, the 4th Armoured Division, and the 6th Armoured Division, coordinated through radio nets that reached every gun in range in under 3 minutes. They disappeared into the snow. The division that had carried Adolf Hitler's name across half of Europe was now sending companies of frostbitten teenagers against walls of shellfire. And there was nothing left to send after them. On the 8th of January 1945, Adolf Hitler signed a piece of paper in a bunker 300 miles from the fighting. The paper authorized Field Marshal Walter Model to give up the ground west of Houffalize and south of Bastogne. It was, in the language of the German High Command, a routine administrative document. It was, in the language of what had actually happened in the snow around Lutrebois, an admission: the attack had failed. The corridor had not been cut. The bodyguard division that had carried the Führer's own name into battle for 6 years, from Warsaw to Paris to Kharkov to the Ardennes, was ordered to pull out of the line and move to the rear for what the paperwork called refitting. There would be no refitting worth the name. The men who limped out of the Belgian forests on the 10th of January were shadows of the division that had rolled into it on the 29th of December. Their tanks were burning in the snowfields behind them. Their Panzer Grenadier battalions were down to 80 and 100 men each. Their commander, Werner Pötschke, would be dead within 3 months, killed during the collapse of Germany's last offensive in Hungary. On the 9th of January, one day before the Leibstandarte began its retreat, George Patton's Third Corps launched a coordinated attack to pinch off the small bulge the Germans had managed to push into his flank. The American line began grinding forward, a kilometre here, 800 metres there. By the 15th of January, the villages the Leibstandarte had died trying to hold were back in American hands. Lutrebois, Villers-le-Bonneau, Loutremange, the chateau at Losange, its walls scorched by artillery, its outbuildings reduced to piles of stone, the road between them torn to ruts and crater rims by 4 weeks of shellfire. The corridor into Bastogne, which had been the entire object of the German attack, had never closed for a single hour. Not one truck of ammunition had been prevented from reaching the garrison. Not one wounded man had been prevented from coming out. Why did the German attack fail so completely? The tanks were not the reason. Sit with that for a moment, because everything about how this battle is usually told points the other way. The Panther was, gun to gun, the finest medium tank of the Second World War. Its long 75mm gun could kill a Sherman at ranges the Sherman could not answer. Its frontal armour, sloped and thick, was virtually immune to the Sherman's main gun from the front. The Tiger II, the 70-ton monster in the heavy tank battalion attached to the Leibstandarte, was so heavily armoured that in a straight gun-to-gun duel at long range it could not be reliably killed at all. The SS crews knew this. They believed it. They had ridden Panthers across the steppes of Russia and knew what those machines could do. The Americans knew it too. The Americans, having learned what happened to men who tried to fight a Panther on its own terms, simply did not fight the duel that the Panther was designed to win. They flanked. They called artillery. They waited for the thunderbolts. They put 6 Shermans behind a ridge, engines off, and waited for the German tanks to turn a corner and expose their sides. When the sides came around, the shots came from angles the Panther's armor was never designed to stop. That is what killed the Leibstandarte at Lutrebois. Not the Sherman, something bigger than the Sherman. Every American vehicle in the battle carried a radio. Every rifle company had a forward observer who could call for fire. Every artillery battalion in range of a target could be brought down on that target inside 3 minutes by a fire direction center that knew where all the guns were and what they were doing at every moment. A spotter in an unarmed Piper Cub could see a column of German tanks, write coordinates on a scrap of paper, and drop the paper into a waiting ambush. A forward observer on a hillside could speak 6 syllables into a handset and have the massed guns of an entire field army answer him almost at once. That was the weapon that broke the German attack. It was not a tank, it was not a plane, it was not any single piece of equipment on the American side. It was a system. Tanks and tank destroyers and infantry and artillery and fighter bombers all talked to each other. They all moved as one coordinated thing. They all knew what the others were doing. They could concentrate the effect of 100 guns on a single stretch of road in the time it took a German tank to travel from one field to the next. The Germans had courage. They had the best armor in the world. They had crews who had been killing tanks since 1941. Against the integrated machine that George Patton had put in the field, all of that counted for less than it should have. It counted for less because the Germans could be seen faster than they could maneuver. It counted for less because they could be fixed faster than they could react. It counted for less because they could be crushed by the concentrated fire of weapons they never even saw firing. The lesson had been taught to them 3 months earlier, in Lorraine, when their panzers had tried to overrun another exposed Patton flank around a town called Aracourt, and had died in the mud among American Sherman tanks and tank destroyers they never quite located. Bastogne was the second time they learned it. There would not be a third opportunity. Now, before this story goes any further, there is a piece of business to attend to. The title of the video you are watching says that this was Germany's last Panzer division. It was not. You deserve to hear that straight. The Leibstandarte was the first SS Panzer division. It was the most decorated. It was Hitler's personal bodyguard, but it was not the last Panzer division Germany had, and Germany still had Panzer divisions in the field after Bastogne. What ended in the snow around Lutrebois was something bigger and more specific than the destruction of a single division. What ended was the last major German offensive in the West. What ended was the last operational armoured reserve that Hitler had hoarded and hidden and saved for a decisive strike. For months in the autumn of 1944, Hitler had pulled his best Panzer divisions out of the line and rebuilt them behind the Rhine. He had done it in secret. Colonel Oskar Koch had seen it happening from 400 miles away and told his general what was coming. Almost no one else in the Allied camp had believed it. That hidden reserve was the shape of the 9th twist in this story. It was gone, all of it, spent in 3 weeks in the Ardennes in exchange for a wedge that the Allies erased by the end of January. The strategic decision to launch the Bulge had consumed everything Germany still had to spend. 8 German Panzer divisions and 2 Panzer Grenadier divisions had gone into the offensive in December in something resembling combat condition. Every one of them came out ruined. The Eastern Front, where the Red Army was already massing for the winter offensive that would carry it to Berlin, was stripped of exactly the reserves it desperately needed. The Red Army launched its own attack on the 12th of January. By the end of that month, Soviet spearheads were on the Oder River, 90 kilometers from Berlin. Germany would pay for the Ardennes on the Eastern Front for the next 4 months, and the men who paid the price were the same men who had already paid once in the Belgian snow. That brings us to the 10th twist, the one nobody remembers. The men of the Leibstandarte who survived Lutrebois were not sent home to rest. In the middle of January, with the Bulge lost and the Wehrmacht reeling, Hitler pulled his battered SS Panzer divisions out of the Western Front and ordered them refitted in a hurry. He was not finished. He had one more offensive left in him, and the offensive was not going to be in the West. In March of 1945, the same SS divisions were sent to Hungary. The operation was called Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening. Its objective was to relieve pressure on Budapest and to secure the last major oil fields still under German control in the area around Lake Balaton. The plan was built on a threadbare premise. The divisions committed to it were already broken. The ground they had to attack across turned to bottomless mud the moment the spring thaw began. It failed as completely as Bastogne had failed, and it failed faster. The Red Army absorbed the attack. The Red Army counterattacked. The Red Army drove the SS divisions back across Hungary and into Austria, through mud that swallowed tanks whole, through villages where the fighting was measured in individual houses. The tank crews of the Leibstandarte, who had lived through the snow at Lutrebois, died in the mud of the Danube plain a few weeks later. Manfred Thorn, the crewman whose account of December 30th we have been reading, survived. He was captured, eventually, and lived to write a memoir. Most of the men who had climbed out of burning Panthers with him did not. Werner Pötschke died in Hungary. Wilhelm Mohnke, the 33-year-old divisional commander, was pulled out of Hungary and sent to Berlin to command the defense of the government quarter as the Red Army closed in on the city. He was captured by Soviet troops in Berlin on the 2nd of May, in the last hours of the fighting for the city. He was taken to a Soviet prison and spent the next 10 years in captivity before being returned to West Germany, where he lived quietly, refused to give interviews, and died in his bed in 2001 at the age of 90. He never publicly apologized for anything he had done. Adolf Hitler shot himself in the head in his bunker on the 30th of April. By then, the men who had worn his name on their cuffs at Lutrebois were mostly dead, mostly captured, or mostly walking west out of Austria, trying to reach American lines before the Red Army caught them. Less than 4 months after the last German attack at Bastogne collapsed in the snow, the war in Europe was over. The Leibstandarte, or what was left of it, laid down its weapons in Austria in May of 1945, having fought its way from the victory parades of 1940 to the wreckage of a lost war without ever quite believing, until the very last week, that it could be beaten. The numbers of the Battle of the Bulge are worth stating plainly, because they are how history keeps score of what happened. Germany lost roughly 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, about 700 tanks and assault guns, roughly 1,600 aircraft. Not one of those losses could be replaced. The trained crews were irreplaceable. The industrial capacity to build new Panthers and Tigers was being bombed to slag in Bavaria and the Ruhr. The pilots who could fly the new jets were being killed faster than the new jets could be built. The Americans lost more than 75,000 men, killed, wounded, and captured. The Battle of the Bulge was the costliest single engagement American forces fought in the entire European war, but the American losses could be made good. Replacement soldiers were already crossing the Atlantic by ship. Replacement tanks were rolling off assembly lines in Detroit. Replacement pilots were finishing their training in Texas and California. Whatever was lost at Bastogne could be, and was replaced within weeks. Whatever was lost by the Germans at Bastogne was lost forever. That is what industrial war meant. That is why the 20th century ended the way it did. Sit with the arithmetic for a moment, because it explains everything. 2 armies met in the snow of the Ardennes in the winter of 1944. One of them believed in the courage of the individual soldier, the quality of the individual weapon, the fanaticism of the individual division. It fielded, arguably, the finest tanks in the world and some of the most experienced armoured crews any army had ever put in the field. The other believed in a system, radios in every vehicle, forward observers with every rifle company, fighter bombers on strip alert on frozen airfields waiting for a break in the weather. Artillery battalions wired together by fire direction centers that could bring 100 guns onto a target inside 3 minutes. Assembly lines in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles that never stopped day or night for the entire duration of the war. The system won. The system won because it did not depend on any single man being brave enough, or any single tank being tough enough, or any single division being fanatical enough. It won because it distributed the burden of killing across an entire industrial civilization and let that civilization do the killing for it. The Panther at Lutrebois did everything it was designed to do. It just could not do it fast enough to matter. There is one last image to leave you with. It is midday on the 30th of December 1944. 6 Sherman tanks are sitting behind a low ridge east of the Bastogne highway. Their engines are off, their turrets are down, only the top few inches of their gun mantlets are visible above the crest. 2,000 meters away, through the last of the lifting mist, 6 Panzer IVs from the finest SS division Germany had ever put in the field are rolling across an open snowfield, turning their sides to the ridge as they hunt what they think is their target. Somewhere above them, an unarmed Piper Cub circles at low altitude. An American observation pilot writes coordinates on a scrap of paper. He wraps the paper around a stone. He drops it out the window. 4 seconds later, the paper lands in the snow in front of an American tank commander, who reads it, looks up at the ridge to his east, gives an order, and changes the outcome of a battle that Adolf Hitler had staked the last hopes of the Third Reich on. 6 Shermans fire. The lead Panzer IV stops dead. The rest are dead within 10 minutes. That is the story of how the last great German attack in the West ended. Not with a duel of steel and courage, not with a clash of fanaticism and skill, with a scrap of paper. With a stone, with a system. Thanks for staying with this one to the end. If this story was new to you, or if you learned something you did not know, hit the like button. Subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment and tell me which Battle of the Bulge you want covered next, because I read every one of them. Above all, respect the men who fought on both sides of that snowfield. Respect the American soldiers who held the corridor open through the cold and the fire. Remember that the men in the German tanks were, most of them, boys who had been handed an ideology and a rifle by a state that would abandon them in a Belgian forest and never bring them home. Honor the veterans, never forget the history, and I will see you in the next story.